Hello and welcome back to Build, Build, Build. I'm Tabitha Goldstraw, the co-founder of CogX, and it's a delight to welcome you from wherever you are in the world today. Don't forget to check out the expo on our platform and drop a line to some of the brilliant organizations to make some connections and continue the conversation. The next session looks at the most important question that beckons the startup world. How do you scale a company with a moral compass? We're delighted to welcome Rob Chesnut, former Chief Ethics Officer of Airbnb. Rob spent 14 years with the US Justice Department as a federal prosecutor, and he was also the Senior Vice President of Trust and Safety at PayPal. He's recently released his book, Intentional Integrity: How Smart Companies Can Lead an Ethical Revolution. And Rob will be in discussion with dear friend, researcher, and broadcaster, Stephanie Hare. Rob, Stephanie, are you there? Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, Rob. It's so nice to get to talk with you face to face, having spent 24 hours with your book, which I've been doing with great pleasure and have completely marked up in true teacher fashion and student fashion, loving it. So I wanted to first ask you, what made you want to write this book?
Well, about 4 years ago, it struck me that the world was changing. The Me Too movement, headlines every day, it seemed, were going after tech companies in particular, but really all companies, challenging them, I think, with their business models. And I think it was very clear to me that the world wanted more from companies, wanted more from leaders. And I think trust in government is at an all-time low, to be honest. And we need companies to step up and solve some of the world's biggest problems. And that led me on a journey at Airbnb. We asked the question, how do you drive integrity into the culture of a company? And we ended up doing some interesting things that I really felt would deserved a broader conversation. So that got me into the book writing world.
And I love the structure of your book. So for those of you who have not read it yet, it's super practical. And I actually was thinking that it'd be quite useful for very different audiences. I can imagine this book being a sort of set text on business school programs or MBA programs, but also I could see C-suite executives, boards, who are often the sort of shadowy people who have so much power and influence over companies. And even founders of startups and self-employed people, small limited companies, looking at this from the beginning of the startup of their company and thinking what the questions you're asking about, what are your values, what's your purpose, how are you going to measure that, were super practical. And I just wondered if you could speak a bit about how your background, first as a prosecutor and then when you made the transition to the private sector, helped you structure this very practical approach.
Yeah, I'm not much of a Socrates and Plato type, right? I didn't study ethics in college or in law school. I think I've been very much shaped by, working as an attorney for 35 years and working with a lot of different tech companies to, actually figure things out that we can do. So, the book is really designed to be, it's got humor, it's got a lot of stories, and it's a practical, almost a workbook in many ways, approach to, how do you drive integrity into the culture? What should you do tomorrow to start if you want to build a company that's got values that you're proud of? I think as a tech GC, I had to be very worried that things around integrity are actually one of your biggest brand risks. On the other hand, the integrity, I think, is a real driver of the business. If you get it right, it's wind at your back. It's something that employees rally behind. Today's consumers, it resonates with them, and they're moving their money based on how a company acts in the world as a world player ethically. So, this is really something for people that want to get business right. In the long run.
And it focuses a lot on your experience in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that was really striking to me as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of the film Wall Street. and Michael Douglas's character, Gordon Gekko, when he says, greed is good. And that was the sort of way that we thought about banking and finance back in the 1980s in the United States. And here we are in 2020, and we've had this sort of revolution in Silicon Valley now for probably 40 years, you could say, certainly with the advent of the personal computer and then e-commerce and social media platforms. And did we hear the same conversation about integrity and ethics in finance as we hear at least discussed in technology?
Well, I think we were operating with a different set of rules for decades. I think when you went to business school, you learned about Milton Friedman and Michael Jensen. And Michael Jensen was a professor who they came up with this idea of shareholder value. And shareholder value was the way that companies operated. That was their North Star, right? Anything that is good for shareholder value is good. And shareholder value really is code for stock price. And unfortunately, I think short-term stock price. But what it did, I think it justified a lot of bad behavior, frankly. It encouraged companies to cut ethical corners in order to get the stock price up. And it really, I think, gave everyone almost ethical permission to do this sort of thing. Because, hey, as long as I'm driving up the stock price, it's okay, because that's what I'm supposed to do. The interesting thing is who benefited with this shareholder value approach. Well, it was the executives at these companies, because they're the ones that held the stock and were compensated in stock. So I believe that shareholder value in this old approach really did a lot of damage. It basically said, well, it's okay to dump carbon into the sky, or don't worry about what you're putting into the stream next to the factory, or how workers are being treated. It's all okay because you're doing what you're supposed to do in the world of shareholder value. The world's tired of that approach. And in fact, it's interesting, Michael Jensen, the academic behind it, has now come out and admitted that he was wrong, and that it's not the way to think about companies. And only though in the last couple of years have we begun to get this broad consensus around leaving behind shareholder value and going to the new approach. And the new approach is the stakeholder approach, or the stakeholder principles. Brian Chesnut at Airbnb, we used to call it being a 21st century company. And that approach recognizes that all companies have multiple stakeholders. That is, groups that the company really owes an obligation to. And, look, investors, shareholders, they are a stakeholder, and they're an important stakeholder. But there's no reason why they should be the only stakeholder. At Airbnb, we had 5 stakeholders. We had our investors, but we also had guests, our host, our employees, and, frankly, the world at large. So I think whenever we made a decision at Airbnb, we would think about how that decision would impact all 5 of the stakeholders. We would measure the health of all 5 stakeholders. And I think we recognized that if we were ignoring any one of those stakeholders over a period of time, that we were failing as a company. And I think that approach encourages doing the right thing. It encourages thinking about a broader audience, not just thinking about your short-term stock price and what's good for your wallet.
Well, it's interesting because what we've just done is take us from this one metric of share price, or perhaps quarterly results, and really broaden this out to the different stakeholders that you're going to have, and also over time, not just per quarter. And I think already that complicates, and that leads me, I guess, on to the next question. And it's a question for the technologists in the audience, but also people who have to build, which is, how does one build a moral compass for a company, particularly if it's a global company that's going to be drawing on different values from different people all over the world, as employees, as investors, as clients and customers? How do you find your North Star when you're global?
Well, you've got to start with that North Star. Every company needs a purpose, Stephanie, and profit is not purpose. Now, profit is an important part of a business. I mean, without profit, you can't fund all of the things that you want to do. You can't accomplish your mission. But your mission's got to be more than just making money. You got to have an aim, a North Star to do good in the world, to have that purpose. And that's got to infuse everything you do in a company. And that needs to be something that's global, that resonates around the world if you're a global company. And you need a new way of measuring. I found in companies, you do what you measure, right? Now, we're good at measuring money. We're very good at measuring all of the financial success metrics. We're great at figuring out, what's our revenue, what's our profit, how many customers do we have, and the like. What we need to do is we need to build that out for a broader group of stakeholders and understand, what for Airbnb, for example, what are metrics that will measure the health of our host community? What sort of metrics are we going to use to measure the health of our guests and whether our guests are happy? And what's our obligation to the communities where we operate, and how are we going to measure that? But you need to measure, and you need to hold yourself accountable to this belief that all of those stakeholders really do matter. And look, it's not easy. I think being a leader just got a lot harder, to be honest, right? In the old days, bad behavior got swept under the rug. You were judged by your share price. Now, just having your share price go up isn't good enough anymore. You've got the complexities of managing, a global base of stakeholders and their trade-offs, right? Because if one decision might be good for two stakeholders, it might be bad for a third stakeholder and neutral for 4 and 5. So do you do it or not? Because look, if a decision is good for all stakeholders, then it's pretty easy. But unfortunately, most decisions aren't that easy. So I think leadership's tougher, frankly.
And you do a great job in your book of bringing that up, where you say everybody's watching now. So it used to be perhaps easier to get away with so-called bad behavior. And now we've got, forums where employees can go and complain anonymously. We've got social media. So there's this really interesting tension of workplace surveillance, which I think has become perhaps even more salient now that so many more people are working from home and being spied on by their employers. But there's also this really interesting shift in power, which is that workers and former employees, third parties, clients and customers all can feed back in real time in ways that can be really embarrassing for companies that get things wrong. And then everybody's going to watch to see what you do to correct it and address the mistake. So I think you raise that so well here. And I love that you hold yourself accountable in the book as well. You talk through a lot of your experiences and sort of testimonies at the different places where you worked. And that makes this book, for me, it felt really practical and very real. I could really sense, the struggles that you went through in your career. And I just want to sort of highlight the structure here of this a bit. What I found really interesting, and I wanted to ask you how you chose them, is you have this thing called code moments, which are almost like teachable moments. So these lessons, and you've got them in the appendix, a whole series of them, where they're just short little vignettes where you take the reader through an example of an ethical decision, and then you give your take on what the answer would be. And I found myself weirdly, I did use your book as a workbook. I went and actually read those first. Yeah. And I read through, first I started with your take on what you thought the answer was, then I read through it, did a whole sort of spin on that, and then went and started your book. But I thought that was just brilliant, those teaching moments. And I wanted to know, A, how did you come up with that as a teaching method? Because I think it's quite effective. And B, how did you do that? Because those are composite examples. How did you craft them so well?
Well, I had a great co-writer, Joan Hamilton, who helped. You know what? The people love to learn with stories. I learned that at Airbnb. When we would talk about integrity, if you start quoting people the law, or you start reading the code of ethics to them, you can just see the eyes glaze over. Mm. But if you tell people real stories about things that actually happened, ethical mistakes, people getting drunk at a holiday party and biting a security guard and drawing blood, or people, someone getting a bag of cash from a vendor. their eyes light up, because we all love stories, particularly true stories. And by the way, if you're in the world of ethics and integrity, you don't have to be very creative. The stories of things that have gone on in business are just so interesting and illuminating. So we really took things that had actually happened, throughout my career, either at companies where I worked or companies where I advised, or things that Joan had dealt with at her companies. And, I think sometimes ethics and integrity are easy, right? It's no lying, no cheating, no stealing. But they actually can be pretty complicated as well. They can be gray and layered. So what we did was we took some of these real examples and really dug into them and sort of looked at them from different angles and talked about the nuances. And, the goal isn't to leave you throwing up your hands and saying, oh, this is too darn complicated. This ethics stuff is beyond me. It really was to help people be thoughtful about what they do every day. I so often we aren't intentional. We walk through our life and just react as things go. I'll give you an example, though, of intentionality, and that's around alcohol. Look, as a lawyer, I have dealt with so many instances of misconduct at companies where I've worked, and too often the misconduct is preceded by somebody drinking too much in a work setting. You see it a lot, right? And there are companies. Some companies have a reputation for being big party companies, and so one thing I did is I talked to everybody at Airbnb about something I called Rob's rule, and this is a rule I've had my whole life around alcohol. And the rule is, for me, Rob's rule is I will never have more than 2 drinks in a work setting, ever, no exceptions. Now, why? Why did I do this? Well, I enjoy a good glass of wine or a local beer when I'm out traveling and having fun with colleagues. The social element, I think, of working with other people is really important. On the other hand, I know that I can have 2 drinks too, and I'm going to be okay. I know myself. Now, what if I'm really tired? What if the drinks are strong? What if I haven't had enough food? Well, at some point, you start getting to drink number 3 with a different combination of circumstances, and I'm not so sure anymore. And for me, my career is worth more to me than that 3rd drink ever. So to make it really simple, I won't go past that 2nd drink. Now, I would tell people at Airbnb, you don't need to adopt Rob's rule. Rob's rule is not in the code of ethics, but you need your own rule. Some people don't drink alcohol at all. Some people don't ever drink in a work setting. Some people might have a 1-drink rule. I know somebody that only drinks with strangers, which I think is some interesting pros and cons. But you need a rule, because the worst time to make a decision about how much alcohol to drink in a work setting is while you're drinking alcohol in a work setting. So what I encourage people is to put some thought into certain circumstances that can derail your career. Do it in advance, because you're going to make much better decisions that way.
I love that. That's a great way for us to switch over to the next bit, because you've got a chapter. So after I read the case studies at the back, the code moments, you have a chapter called "What Will Derail Your Mission? The 10 Most Common Integrity Issues," which I was like, oh, shit, I better read that. And they're, you don't hold back. Like, that's what I love, is I think a lot of people would think this is something that maybe human resources needs to be aware of, or perhaps managers. But I love the way that you put the C-suite and the board, and frankly, every single person in an organization on the spot in these examples. And you cover, I'm looking at it here, inappropriate relationships. Obviously, you've just covered booze and drug use at work or in situations. We go straight into sexual harassment and sexual assault. And with your lawyer's hat on, you gave one of the best distinctions I've ever come across of the difference between those in a US law context, which I thought was great. Expenses violations, it's a section on data privacy. That's obviously, extremely relevant. The conflicts of interest bit I found fascinating. And, that is well beyond just human resources. That is something that everyone in the company needs to be aware of. Great stuff on fraud. sharing of confidential information and trade secrets, bribery and gifts, which, when you're starting out in your career is not something you necessarily might even think is going to cross your path. So to have a thought about it before that awkward situation happens. And then the last one, employee use of social media, which again is such a minefield for everyone. You get so nitty gritty and practical that I found myself, as I say, just sort of underlining every section. And again, I wondered going forward, how you hope this book would be used. Is this to get people using this book almost to talk as a reference guide among themselves or to read on their own?
Yeah, you know what, Stephanie? Silence and ambiguity are the enemies of integrity. I think in silence, everyone is free to interpret for themselves what is right or wrong. And what we know from science is that in the absence of information, people tend to fudge. They tend to look at particular circumstances and interpret the circumstance in a way that's favorable to themselves. Yeah. And pretty soon what ends up happening is you fudge a little bit, you fudge a little bit more, you fudge a little bit more. And pretty soon you're nicely out of bounds or well out of bounds from what appropriate behavior should be. So what I really want with this book is to make sure the companies understand that people are looking for guidance. When we do talks at Airbnb, I think I do new employee talks there. And, people are a little wide-eyed at first. They're like, wow, he's actually talking about that topic that nobody talks about. And I think too often integrity is the elephant in the room. No one wants to actually have the conversation about it, but people got a lot of questions in the back of their mind. Is it okay if, that I'm kind of interested in that employee? Is it okay to have a relationship with them? Is it okay if this vendor takes me out to an expensive restaurant? And I think having the direct, honest human conversation with people about this is something that they deeply appreciate. I did a new employee talk one day at Airbnb. A woman came up to me afterwards. She literally had tears coming down her cheeks, Stephanie. And I'm thinking, oh no, what did I say? Oh, and she explained that she had just come from another big tech company, big name company. And she said, Rob, my boss there kept propositioning me and he wouldn't stop. And I didn't trust that my old company would do anything about it. And so I had to leave my job because of this. And she said, this is my first day at my new job. She said, you have no idea what it means to have a leader stand up in front of the room and talk about these things directly and honestly and explain that that's not the way that they operate. And she said, I know if I had a problem like that at Airbnb, I could come forward and feel comfortable about it because I really believe that Airbnb cares. And that's what you want, right? You want people to hear directly from a leader that this stuff matters. Not in some pre-recorded video, not some third-party consultant, not some poster on the wall. They need to hear it honestly from that leader in their own words, off script.
I'm so glad you mentioned the video and the poster because I wanted to, if I may, put on my sort of more challenging, cynical hats, just to see how you'd respond. I have worked in those companies that have used the video or the poster and then been like, job done. We've talked about equality. There's no sexual harassment here because everybody had to, we did a box ticking exercise. We've all had the training and it didn't stop it. And in fact, what it did was it actually had a more corrosive effect, which is that people didn't trust human resources at all and thought HR is just here to protect the company. And you talk a lot about different companies in your book. You give some really lovely examples, very practical examples, and familiar to anyone who's reading the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis. And I think that's a risk. And I love your solution, if I think I understand correctly, is that this isn't just an HR issue. Now, you were writing as general counsel, so it would make sense coming from a legal perspective that you would be really thinking those issues through and how to live your values as a company. but you really put that pressure onto leaders, and particularly the CEO, that they have to make that clear, not just once a year, and not just in a video. It has to be there all the time, continuously. And you devote 2 chapters to that. And I was just wondering if you could talk us through, the role of the C-suite, in particular the CEO, but also this messaging thing, so that it isn't just an HR problem or a lawyer problem.
Right. Well, I mentioned earlier this idea that silence and ambiguity are the enemies of integrity, and that people naturally, all of us, tend to fudge a little bit in our own self-interest in the absence of information. But as human beings, we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel as though, I've got integrity, and of course, I'm at least as honest and ethical as others. So when looking around to others, we really do look to others for cues about what's appropriate. And if we see leaders speaking and acting with integrity, it's actually contagious from a scientific perspective. It actually influences our behavior. Leaders are the thermostat for integrity. Now, not a thermometer. A thermometer takes the temperature in a room. A thermostat sets it. So as a leader, by your words and actions, you are setting the temperature. You're setting the environment for the entire company. So if, as a leader, for example, you're getting trashed at the holiday party, you are hitting sexually on other employees, or you're running around saying things like, "We have to hit this number no matter what. I don't care how you get it done, get it done." That sets the thermostat to one side. On the other hand, if you do what like Ben Horowitz used to do, every quarter, Ben Horowitz told me he used to sit down with his chief financial officer to look at the quarterly numbers. And he said that before he started, every quarter, he'd look at the CFO and he would say, "Is there anything in these numbers that makes you uncomfortable? Anything at all? Anything that you think is misleading? Anything that you think is ambiguous or potentially improper from an accounting perspective?" He said, because we might miss a number. Our stock price might go down. I might even lose my job, but I'm not going to jail. And if you have a conversation like that with your team, you are setting the thermostat in another place. And the key is everybody's watching you as a leader, right? Everybody's looking to you for cues. And as leaders, you've got to embrace that. You've got to understand that ethics or integrity, they don't belong to the general counsel. They don't even really belong to the chief ethics officer or the head of HR. They belong to everybody. I used to say at Airbnb that I wanted 5,000 chief ethics officers. I want everybody to feel like they've got a stake in this culture. But leaders in particular, they got to own it. That's to me just a critical part of your job description, no matter what function you're in.
Well, you mentioned this question of who owns the ethics in the company, and I love this idea that why would you have just one chief ethics officer when you could have the whole company is effectively doing that role? And you talk about ethics ambassadors, people who could sort of receive extra training and be embedded throughout the organization to be there on consultation, standby if needed for whenever an issue is coming up, and there being a quick way of doing this. And I guess what I wanted to push back on is I think most companies, from the really wonderful ones that have great reputations in the market to some of the most horrific that makes everyone just sort of go, "You are kidding me," have the mission statement. They have the frameworks and the guidelines and the principles, and they might even have like an ethics committee, right? There's a lot of Silicon Valley tech companies that have ethics committees that effectively are just rubber stamping exercises. And here in the United Kingdom, we had an ethics committee to come up with our contact tracing app for the coronavirus, and then it was dismantled. And so we've rolled out an app to citizens that hasn't got an ethics committee behind it. So it's just kind of interesting that there is a formula to build ethics and institutionalize it, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily work. And I guess that's my question, and that I really boiled down and was hunting for in your book, and I just love to push you on it a bit, is that, if Exxon is doing all of these things, if Uber was doing all of these things, and if Facebook is doing all of these things in Google, and they still get into ethical quandaries, are those the right tools, or do we need something else?
Well, I think you've got to start, with the heart of the company and what your purpose is. And I think you've mentioned some examples of companies who their mission's to get big, right? They, what you've never heard, particularly in the earlier days of the company, was any sort of mission to do good in the world, no sort of greater purpose, and no obligation to think about the community and the world as a stakeholder. No measurement. Like if you looked at ExxonMobil and asked them, to measure whether they are having a positive impact in the world, and nailed down metrics that we could all agree upon would be measures of their impact in the world, their record would be terrible, right? You would have to concede that the amount of carbon that's put in the air as a result of their products is deeply disturbing, and so I think a lot of this gets just washed over, right? There's an ethics committee, there's talk, but without specific metrics that recognize multiple stakeholders, and without the transparency, you're right. These companies are going to fail. I think the difference today, Stephanie, is, unlike the past, there's transparency like never before. So, companies in the past operated with a certain level of, there was a lot of secrecy that sort of shrouded what actually went on inside of a company. When I was growing up, the only way you could research a company was go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? That got updated every 10 years. Now, there's a lot of information available at everyone's fingertips through the internet, and employees are speaking up, right? If employees see something going on at a company that's inconsistent with the values, if employees are looking at the big, broad, beautiful statement on the website, but they know inside the company it's not operating that way, in the past, they weren't saying anything. Today, they're speaking up. Today, they're talking to each other on the Blind app and in Slack. They're posting about it. They're tweeting about it. They're walking out. And I think what we see now that we didn't see before is a world that is pushing on companies. That's not just accepting the broad general statements anymore, but they're pushing for real action. They're demanding it. Between the government, employees, and customers, pressure is on companies now like never before. And I think that's a great thing.
And what do you think about things like non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements that can actually prevent or at least really raise the risks for any employee that did want to speak out about ethical wrongdoing, particularly when so many companies will make you sign them when you join and when you leave, right? They might give you a little bit of sort of goodwill money in exchange. And if you've got people who are paying off student loans or who have mortgages or they're in this economic climate, maybe they don't feel they can't take that money, but also they might genuinely think, I can't fight against big tech. Susan Fowler, who wrote that wonderful book, Whistleblower, about her time at Uber, it's a horrific book because of what Uber did to her. I mean, they sicked private investigators on her. They harassed her. They trashed her reputation. It was super stressful. Right. And not everybody is going to be up for that fight. Right. So I'm just intrigued because I'm with you. I think the power of employees to hold current and former employees to hold their employers to account is helpful for the public. But at the same time, they're not able, this is not an equal fight. Right. As a lawyer, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the fight's getting a lot more equal. Susan Fowler would not have been able to do what she did 20 years ago. And increasingly what people are finding is that when they speak up, the world is lining up behind them to support them. When it comes to non-disclosure agreements, at Airbnb, we basically got rid of them. Simply because of the potential for abuse. So what we decided was, when I started looking at the Me Too movement, it struck me that over and over again, not at Airbnb, I'm talking about, I love to learn from other people's mistakes. So I looked at other places, and it started with all employees were being required to go to arbitration for their disputes. Well, arbitration is by definition, everything's quiet, it's confidential, right? And then you end up with a settlement agreement where there are non-disclosure provisions and you can't talk about it. And then the person that committed the misdeed is then, even if they are fired, they just go to another company and no one ever knows about what happened. So what we decided to do is we sat down one day in the legal department and said, why do we need arbitration clauses? And people say, they might sue us in court. And I said, so what? You know what? Maybe we should be prepared for that. And we looked and said, how many employees actually sue us anyway? Because we really do our best to treat people well. And it was like, well, it really hardly ever happens. And so if we're really trying to do the right thing by employees, we shouldn't get in that position very often. And then we decided, you know what, we'll stand up and tell employees, you know what, if you've got a dispute with the company, all we ask is that you come to us first and try to resolve it. And if we can't resolve it to your satisfaction, then you get to decide what to do. You can decide whether to go to court or go to arbitration. So that way we're not going to be protected in a confidential way. And then we also pledged publicly that we would no longer use non-disclosure clauses, no more NDAs. Anytime an employee or a customer, we settled a case with them, we would never require that they be silent about the actions that were underlying the lawsuit. We said, you know what? We don't ever want to be accused of suppressing or hiding. Now, we might not agree with what they have to say. We might feel as though that, there's another version of the facts, but that's okay. We'd rather take our chances, I think, with the disclosure and the publicity than to ever be accused of trying to hide things. And that, because that's fundamentally wrong. And that's how you avoid it. And what we've now seen, I know in the US, if there's a settlement provision that has a non-disclosure agreement, it can no longer be deducted as an expense for tax purposes. So now governments are starting to line up and say, you know what, companies, you're not going to be able to operate this way anymore. And I think that level of transparency, look, transparency is the great deodorant. So I think again, the world is again pushing, everything's moving toward more transparency. Everything's moving toward raising the bar for companies.
Well, you talk about transparency in a really interesting way that I don't think I've come across before, which is also giving examples of when you have successfully resolved ethical issues. And you talk about why companies might not want to do that because it might then reveal that there had been a problem. But this idea of providing data rather than anecdata about, we've had 200 calls to the ethics hotline this year, of which 40% were sexual harassment and 10% were expenses fiddling and the rest was people eating more than they should at the canteen. Right. And these were successfully resolved to everybody's satisfaction. 2 are currently we can't talk about them because they're under legal action at the moment, but something like that where people can actually go, holy shit, if I use an ethics hotline, it actually works. How can you provide transparency for when ethics is working? Right.
Well, I would talk to employees and I would always hear a lot of cynicism. It's like, reporting something, nothing ever happens. And I wondered, why do people think that? Because I know that things happen. Why would people be so cynical? And then I realized, Stephanie, the reason they're so cynical is they report things and they never, ever hear anything back. And that struck me as, well, I understand that. What can we do about that problem? Because if people actually knew what happened, I felt as though the trust would go up pretty substantially. And so then I started asking the question. And people, privacy concerns. I'm like, well, I get privacy concerns. That's important. But why not do an annual report? Why not tell employees, we do this, we had this many hotline complaints. We had this many reports to HR. Here's a breakdown statistically of the types of reports. here are the numbers around how many times we investigated and found a violation, and how many times we investigated and couldn't find a violation. And here are the different punishments that resulted. Because I would look at the data and say, you know what, that's actually really comforting. It shows that we take the process seriously, that it's not a rubber stamp, that we just come in and immediately assume guilt. But on the other hand, we don't whitewash it either.
Yeah.
And we do take things seriously. And I felt, you know what, I think if people saw that kind of data, they'd be comforted. And I know, like, I'll give credit, Cisco, I know has been doing this kind of transparency report, and Airbnb's been releasing data to its employees like this. I think it's the right direction. You know, we've got to get away from this world where it's all hush hush. We can't really talk about it at all, because I think that silence is actually creating an environment of distrust that's not healthy.
I couldn't agree more. And I was thinking as I was reading your book how helpful it would be to restore trust if people understood how bullying and sexual harassment were being dealt with in the workplace. Because I think most people just feel that this gets either silenced through being bought off by money, or the person just leaves because it's just easier. And I like that you pave another way forward. And there's something else that you raised that I hadn't seen elsewhere. And I was really grateful to you for putting this in your book. You talk about how it isn't just about your ethics as a company, it's also those of your customers and your partners, right? So you talk about, I think it was the assault rifles in the United States being sold by Dick's Sporting Goods, and how they made a decision to no longer sell that weaponry, and that caused problems in the United States, where there's a Second Amendment in the Constitution that allows people the right to bear arms, and this therefore created an ethical judgment call that this company had to make, and what that meant for their bottom line. It was really interesting because that's such an emotive issue, and I can imagine lots of companies not wanting to touch it, not even go anywhere near it, with the United States being so divided at the moment. You raised that in a really interesting way that I can see for technology companies is also going to be a real challenge, where it's this whole technology is neutral, we're just a platform, we can't be held responsible for editing like a publisher, but also what happens with our product or our data or whatever down the road in the value chain, that's not our responsibility. We're only responsible for our patch. Yeah. You complicate that dynamic much more in a way that was very thought-provoking. And I just wanted to give you, I know we've only got a few more minutes, but I thought, can we end on a meaty note?
All right. I think you've got to own it as a platform. People are tired of this excuse that, well, I'm only a platform, while you continue to count your money and make, and make profit from this sort of thing. You've got to figure out what you're going to stand for as a company. The world doesn't let you get away with that silence. I think a lot of companies for a long time wanted to say, well, we're not involved in that. But the world doesn't satisfy with it. If it shows up on your platform, your logo's up in that corner, your frame is around that particular item. And therefore it actually impacts your brand. So, I think what we see is that the world is increasingly pushing companies to take responsibility for things that are on their website. And look, we've seen this with Facebook. It's been compelling to watch how Facebook has gone from we don't want it, we're First Amendment. We don't want to get involved in this. And now they've got tens of thousands of employees that are working and scouring Facebook to prevent things like election interference and offensive material and poor bad facts. And frankly, they've got to. And because what is on your website becomes your brand. And so you've got to own it. Look, Airbnb did this around white supremacy, where white supremacists were using Airbnb to stay when they were getting together for a rally, like in Charlottesville. And we said, oh, you know what? No, we're not going to go there. That's not what we want to stand for as a company. So we went in, we did the research, we found who they were, and we said, our services are not available to you. And I think it does complicate things, but I think the world will ultimately respect brands that stand for something.
Well, that's a great note for us to wrap up on, which is that whole, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Rob Chesnut, your book, Intentional Integrity, Fantastic. Thank you so much for writing it. It was such a pleasure to read, and I learned ever so much. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Gosh, guys, that was a real journey, both slightly depressing and incredibly optimistic at the same time. I loved it. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who were listening. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Rob's book, and Stephanie's book is in the writing too. So really great conversation. And that's all for me now, but do join us back here at 1 o'clock when we'll be in conversation with the very brilliant VC, Sarah Kunst, looking at the importance of diversity and investing in diversity. So thank you both, and thank you to all of our listeners, and goodbye for now.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.